So welcome everyone to our first seminar for 2025, which is a collaboration between NITheCS and our math, stats, and computer science. Today, our speaker is Daniel Johnson. And Daniel is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Montpellier in France. And his research focuses on the influence of matter along the line of sight, and its impact on observational cosmology.
Yes.
Right? So today we're going to be learning a lot more from him, and he's again going to be talking about strong lensing cosmology and just some more primers to learn a bit more about Daniel. Daniel is actually from South Africa, so he's PMB, as we learned earlier today at tea time. He's done all of his studies at UCT undergrad, honors, as well as a master's before moving to France. So Daniel, we look forward to that.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks so much for coming. I appreciate it very much. So yeah, as you heard, I'm going to be telling you about the cosmology we can do with strong lensing, and in particular, the influence of matter on the line side. I should just say right away, if you have any questions, please interrupt me at any time. If I can answer it, I will. If it's something that I think we should discuss later, I'll postpone it, but I'd much rather you understand as we go than you have a confusion at last. Yeah, so please do feel free to interrupt at any time. So I'm being supervised by Pierre and Julien. Julien Larenna, who I think some of you might know because he spent many years in Cape Town. And Pierre, who did a postdoc at UCT. So before I dive into the lensing, I want to give you an overview, which I think you're all very familiar with, but I think it's nice to introduce it just in case anyone is not sure. So the current status of modern cosmology is that generally when making our observations, when using cosmology in any astrophysics and astronomy we rely on the lambda CDM model, which is incredibly effective for us. It is with just a handful of parameters, we can describe many different types of, we can explain many different types of observations about the universe. So this is great because we only need a handful of ingredients and a few parameters. The most important of which are, of course, dark energy in the form of a cosmological constant, hence the lambda. And this is necessary to explain why the universe is not only expanding, but that expanding is accelerating. So this was a big discovery, as you know, in the last couple of decades, that the universe's expansion is actually accelerating. To explain that, we need some form of dark energy, at least if we stick with GR. And the other part is cold dark matter, so CDM. Cold meaning that it's pressureless, and dark meaning that we don't see it emitting light, hence it's not interacting strongly with the electromagnetic regime. And we need this to explain structure formation, rotation curves of galaxies, explain the strong gravitational lensing we observe, and this accounts for something like 27% of the energy of the universe. So far so good, except of course, as I'm sure you've also heard, there are some problems that are becoming stronger and stronger. Some famous ones include tensions in H0, sigma 8. So we talk about the difference between so-called early universe measures, CMB, and later universe measures, like supernova and galaxy structure, galaxy distribution, large-scale structure. And what we find is that when we measure the Hubble constant, measurements which used to agree when their error bars are nice and big are tending to diverge more and more strongly as time goes on. And so if we use different methods of measuring the Hubble constant, the so-called distance ladder, which requires us to progressively build up our distance measurements until we're looking at supernova at high redshifts, then we find H0 values of around 73, 75. But when we use measurements from the CMB, where we require a cosmological model to actually obtain those measurements, then we're finding values of around 67. And the tension we call between these two measurements is around 5 sigma. So I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's something like a 1 in several tens of thousands chance that this is random. And so that's clearly a big problem for our models, for our observations. The other tension is in the so-called sigma 8 parameter, which tells us about the clustering of matter in the universe. So how much does matter tend to come together? And once again, depending on the measure we use, we find these two starting to diverge. So, please, yeah. Would it disrupt you? Oh, not at all. Yeah, sorry, thank you. Thanks for telling me. Yeah. So that leaves us with some key questions. Cosmology. So what is the source of these tensions? Are they systematics in our measurement? Is something about the way we're measuring these things just biasing our measurements? Or is it something more fundamental, a problem with lambda CDM, maybe even with the underlying model of gravity? What is the nature of dark matter? What is the nature of dark energy? Is dark energy really constant? These things account for the absolute majority of the energy budget in the universe. They remain very fully understood. And so, of course, there's lots of work still to be done in the theoretical aspects, finding new models that can help to explain these tensions, help to identify the nature of these things. But also, as I'm probably here, whenever an observational cosmologist speaks to you, we're always in need of more precise, independent probes of these quantities. So probes which don't depend on stuff we've learned from other probes, but observations that can give us a measurement independent of those other sources. And this way we can really pin down these parameters. By pinning down these parameters, we can better understand what are these ingredients of the universe. So that brings us to gravitational lensing. So gravitational lensing is simply the deflection of the path of the light beam by a gravitational field. So whenever you have the matter inhomogeneity in the universe, the path of the light beam is affected by the curvature of space introduced by that matter. And so if you're very lucky, you might be able to spot this from your telescope. Generally speaking, when we talk about gravitational lensing, historically, we split this into two regimes. So the more dramatic, famous example would be strong gravitational lensing. You might see something like an Einstein ring, as you can see over there. So this is a strong nonlinear distortion by a galaxy or galaxy cluster. It often results in multiple images. So as I'm sure you understood from the animation, all of this light is coming from the same single source. It's being lensed and spread out into this beautiful ring. You might also see multiple point images. And on the other hand, you have weak lensing, which is not possible to see by eye, which refers to small distortions, magnifications, and shapes of galaxies. And weak lensing is something experienced by all light. Every light which is reaching us is weakly lensed in some form or another. Even in a perfectly homogeneous space-time, the fundamental distribution of matter in the universe, the average density, dictates the path of that light beam. And when you have inhomogeneities as we do, then we will introduce some distortions. And I'll speak about this more in a moment, but the idea of weak lensing is to correlate the shapes of galaxies across the whole sky, things that you can't see by eye, but when you start doing these correlations, you start seeing there's some patterns emerging in the shape, which tell us that there's weak lensing going on, and we can use this to see the universe. So I think the easiest way to understand the difference between these is strong lensing, you see it by eye, weak lensing, you don't. It's the best distinguishing. So what can we do with these types of lensing? So from strong lensing, we can, for example, measure H-mode by time delay. So this requires there to be multiple images of a compact source. If that source is variable, so if you imagine at the center of the galaxy, you have like an active galactic nucleus, because it's very small, it can change in brightness fairly rapidly. The distance from one side to another is not too long. You can actually see brightness changing. And if that point source gets multiply imaged, then because the light travels along different paths through space-time, if those paths are different lengths, then fluctuations happening here will be seen at different times on those two images. So for example, if you have two images, you might see a flash of brightness here, and then a few days, months, weeks later, you might see another flash of brightness here. And by looking at the difference in arrival time, you can learn about the expansion of the universe. So this is fantastic because it's independent of the distance ladder, and it requires very, very few cosmological assumptions. So that's potentially exciting. We can also measure things like omega n and the dark energy gradient state from compound lensing. So that's a very special type of lensing, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But basically, this gives us access to not only the current state of dark energy, but how it has evolved in the past. And this is a big effort.
Just a question, what are the chances that we skip perfectly once?
You mean this kind of
the ring?
Yes. So
because it all depends on the position of the source.
Yes.
And,
exactly.
So it can be public.
Absolutely. Yes. So it's almost never that these rings are perfectly spherical. There's always some kind of ellipticity that's caused, and this is one of the key questions we've been working on is where is that ellipticity coming from? To what extent is it the ellipticity of the lens, to what extent is it the ellipticity of the source, and to what extent is it the ellipticity induced by the line of sight. That's something I'm going to speak more about. But if you had a point source, so if you imagine your lens galaxy, if your source was just a point of light, it would need to be perfectly aligned with your lens in order to produce that ray. But because generally galaxies are also extended sources, then as long as enough light is aligned, then you can produce this. What you often see is kind of not perfect rings, but kind of perhaps two arcs, even multiple point sources. You might see, you can get all kinds of things. And at the moment, I think it's a few hundred of these that we know about. But with the new big survey telescopes going up, for example, from Euclid, we expect to see 100,000 of these images. So it's very exciting. It's a good time to do this field.
So we spoke about C.
Yeah.
Was from the, it's pretty stereo. It's pretty good.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. No, we'll chat after I see if it's my thing, if it's something else. Yeah. So it's Euclid, but also actually, what's very exciting being South African is when you find these things in the radio wavelength, you find incredibly thin, beautiful arcs, and that's fantastic for the kind of science I want to do. So it's promising. Unfortunately, we've got maybe 2 of them that have been found. So versus the order of 100,000 with Euclid, we have 2 in the radio. But with SKA, that number should increase comparable to Euclid. So that's very exciting. So yeah, you can also look for dark matter substructures, speaking about earlier as well, where if you have, for example, an image like this, if you have another clump of dark matter sitting between the lens and the observer or within the galaxy, then you might see distortions in the shape of this ring. And people have used that to look for compact halos of dark matter, which might not be giving off light, but are still shaping the path of this light beam that's reaching it. And you can also look for the dark matter content of the galaxy, because of course gravitational lensing cares about matter, not about light. It doesn't care about what kind of matter there is, just about how much of it there is and how it's distributed. And so what you can do is you can try to probe the mass profile of the galaxy compared to the light profile, and a lot about the mass structure of galaxies. Weak lensing, on the other hand, is a much larger statistical measurement, and we generally use these to measure cosmological parameters like sigma 80 omega m. So basically the abundance of matter in the universe and how that matter behaves, so how abundant it is. And the reason we can do that is because weak lensing is sensitive to the matter power spectrum. And so when you're correlating the shapes of galaxies in the sky, your correlation functions depend on the which in turn depend on these parameters. So far so good, except, of course, like I said a moment ago, all light in the universe is lensed. That includes the light from strong lensing, is weakly lensed. And so, in fact, weak lensing is acting on strong lensing just the same. It's a small effect. It's why historically we haven't really cared about it. But actually, as we get increasingly precise with our measurements, these weak lensing impacts are getting more and more important. And in fact, if you want to do these cosmological measurements effectively, you can't ignore these weak lensing effects. But that also works both ways, because weak lensing is affecting strong lensing. Perhaps we can use a strongly lensed image to measure the same things that we're probing with weak lensing. And the question which might come to mind is, well, why bother? We have on the order of billions and billions and billions of galaxies that we can observe, and only at best a few hundred thousand lenses. What statistical power can we get in that? I hope I convince you by the end of this talk why that's not interesting. So yes, so to get into a bit more specifics, when we talk about weak lensing, we generally split this up into 2 effects. If you have a circular image, you have the effect of convergence. Well, it doesn't need to be a circle, whatever shape it is. Convergence will just increase the overall scale of the image or decrease. So if your light passes through an overdense region of the universe, your image just gets bigger. If it passes through an underdense, it just seems smaller. And you also have shear. Shear introduces this kind of elliptical effect into your image, so it distorts the shape of the image. So keep those in mind, because those are the two key types of weak lensing, and the important ones to go. So to talk about how the line of sight can affect strong lenses, if you have a source galaxy, a deflected galaxy, and your observer, typically what you expect to happen is that light will travel from the source as it passes near your source, your deflector galaxy or lens galaxy. It will get lensed, and we'll see light coming from different directions. And if the alignment is good enough, we'll see the Einstein ring. However, the real universe is not perfectly homogeneous space with just a couple of galaxies. It's filled with stuff. And so if we add some matter perturbations, then the path of this light beam is affected, and so the Einstein ring we see will also be affected. So you can imagine as this light is traveling from the source past the lens to the observer, all of the matter that is passing nearby is causing small deflections. And if we integrate those deflections along the path of the light beam, then they can have a non-negative effect on the Einstein ring we see. We generally split these up into 3 terms. So each of these amplification matrices contains both the convergence and the shear that I mentioned earlier. We talk about a term between the observer and the lens, between the lens and the source, and between the observer and the source. But in actual fact, it turns out that these 3 terms conspire to act as though there was only a single term, which is a combination of those 3. So we call this the line of sight convergence and the line of sight shear. And this is what's important. If you're modeling a lens, if you're trying to measure something, this is the only term you have access to. So if you want to read more about this. So if you have a point source, then you might get multiple images from this point source. And that's crucial if you're doing time delay photography. So any questions about the introduction before I dive into So what I'm going to be telling you about, the focus of my lectures, my last year or two, has been how the line of sight biases the cosmology view. So basically, how important are those perturbations for observational cosmology, the things you measure. So both in the measure of Hubble constant, but also in the measure of the dark energy state. And then I think even more interestingly, well, even less uninterestingly, as it depends on your preference, I will speak about using the line of sight as a cosmological process. What can we learn about cosmology by actually studying the line of sight? So, time delay cosmography, like I said, when you have a point source that produces multiple images, I don't know how clear it is to see, but you see 1, 2, 3, 4 images are all originating from the exact same place. So these are multiple images, exact same point source at the center of the source galaxy, because there are multiple geodesic solutions. You can have that a single point being seen at 4 different places, and because the path length is different, the arrival time is different, you see that the light curves of these are offset. So what this diagram is showing is what you would do is you measure the light curve of these point sources, and you try to line them up. So to line it up, image B has been given 0.1 of a day, C 0.5 of a day, and D 0.6 of a day. And once you line them up, you can get access to these numbers. So basically, you know how much quicker is the light arriving here versus here. It turns out the relative time delay is proportional to this ratio of angular diameter distances. And in turn, that ratio is proportional to the inverse Hubble constant. And so by measuring this, if you've modeled the properties of the lens well, you can get access to the Hubble constant.
I've known very little about how do you know that all those images are the same?
So a number of ways. Firstly, well, if I speak about this, you'll find that there are fluctuations in light pretty much perfectly aligned just at the same time. You also look at their redshift, you look at their spectra. So also the fact that they're all seen within the same extended arc. So you never expect, there's no sort of natural mechanism to produce this kind of ring-shaped light, but you can tell from its redshift and again from its spectra that this ring of light is all being traced back to the same point. It's just being lensed. And these point source images, because they lie on that ring, someone who works in lensing will spot this and immediately know they came from the same place. But to verify that, yeah, you look at their spectra, you look at their light curves, their redshifts.
So you can determine uniquely that it's just a single point.
Exactly. Either a single point or identical points at the same redshift with the same spectrum, which is much less likely. And in fact, it particularly unlikely given how it lies in this extended. So this is all, you can imagine an elliptical or a spiral. This is probably a spiral galaxy based on how it looks. All of like these features you can actually reconstruct. So you can, if you model the lens, you can reconstruct a spiral galaxy out of this massive light. It's quite cool. It's the dark arts of the actual modeling. I don't touch it, but it's what they do. So that's cool. So lensing gives you access to these angular diameter distances, and so you can measure the Hubble constant. An even more kind of peculiar system is when you, instead of having two galaxies aligned, you have three. And so what you see here in yellow is the foreground lens galaxy. Then the first ring is a galaxy. In this case, this is a redshift 0.2. This is a redshift 0.6. And then you have an even further source at redshift 2. And what you can actually get is that the light from the intermediate redshift source gets lensed, and the light from the even further one gets lensed an even wider trajectory. And so you get a compound lens, so you get a double ring. And it turns out that they've recently discovered a third source behind this lens. You can't see it in the visible light, but there are multiple images on an even larger radius. So this is an amazing system, the jackpot lens. And what you can do with that is by measuring the ratio of the Einstein radii, so basically the radii of these circles, you can once again have access to a ratio of angular diameter distances. Now you notice that there's two distances over two distances, which means the Hubble constant cancels out. And so you can access things like the dark energy radiation state without it being limited by the Hubble constant. So that's very exciting. But a key point in both of these is that the measurements are depending on angular diameter distances. So when you, in an undergrad or honors cosmology course, when you learn the expression for angular diameter distance, you think of it as a fairly simple combination of redshift and cosmological parameters like m, curvature. But of course, that's in an FLRW background universe. That's in a universe in which you imagine this mass to be spread out perfectly isotropically. So whichever direction we look, we're looking for the same density. And this is why we can express these quantities in such simple cosmological terms. In real space-time, it actually depends on the direction in which you look. So if I look in a region that is overdense, then the angular diameter distance I infer will be this number, which will be slightly smaller than the background angular diameter distance. If the region is underdense, then this number will be slightly bigger than the background. And it all depends on this term here, which is, this kappa refers to the convergence I spoke about earlier. This is the projected mass, projected surface mass density from the observer to the source. So this is true not only for looking from Earth somewhere, but you can look from the lens to the source. This equation is true.
So how do you decide?
So, well, this is the problem. You can't.
That you think
It's unmeasurable. Yeah. So this is what's called the mass sheet degeneracy in lensing, and it's a problem because you cannot separate out these terms. You can try. You can, for example, do galaxy number counts. You can try to look on a line of sight, count how many galaxies you see, and try to estimate the mass. But fundamentally, that term is unmeasurable. And it's not surprising because, like I mentioned, all convergence does is it changes the scale of an image. So understanding, is this an image of this size at this distance, or is it a bit closer and a bit bigger, or is it just intrinsically a bit bigger? These things are basically.
Do you make a model?
Well, I'll show you in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. Yeah. So this term is unmeasurable, meaning we only have access to this, and we're always stuck between these. The good news, of course, is that this is on average 0. So when we talk about the background spacetime, when kappa is equal to 0, it doesn't mean no mass, it means the average mass of the universe. And so if you take enough measurements, you will tend to average out the effects. Additionally, the bigger your aperture is, the less important this is. So if I'm looking at a very big region of the sky, that kappa is not very important. It only becomes important when we have very precise measurements, so our uncertainties are very small, then the uncertainty in this term starts to become very important. And also when our measurements are sparse. So and this is exactly the case in lensing. We have not that many lenses in the sky, but the things we can measure from those lenses, we measure to high accuracy. So if you imagine a kind of an average density universe with kappa is equal to 0, well, with those same background cosmology, we would instead have a situation like this, where if the convergence was greater than 0, the lensing of the light would be more efficient, and actually a more nearby source, we would infer the same background we would infer a smaller angular diameter distance because the background one is being reduced by this time. So that's the key point. This is what you expect, this is what you're actually getting. And the reverse is true. In an underdense line of sight, you would have your source needing to be further away into the angular diameter distance. So this comes to the question, how can we estimate this effect? So it's almost impossible to model for a single line of sight. And in statistics, we can estimate how big the effect is, and how we do that is we take the results of some people who worked very hard and gave us in-body simulations of the universe. That I didn't have to do. Basically, you model the universe as containing only dark matter, which is a good enough approximation for these purposes. And you simulate the light cone of the universe, you trace the path of the light beam through that light cone as it's length, and that gives you a sense of how much convergence and how much shear light beam experiences. And so what you can do is you can take your simulation and you can shoot light beams through it a billion times, as many as you like, and then start to build up some statistics and get a sense of how important these effects are. And so this is some work I was doing last year. Is people they knew about these line of sight things, didn't really know whether they're important. And so actually putting some numbers and understanding how important they are. So when it comes to the Hubble constant, depending on the redshift of your lens, this effect is either bigger or smaller. It turns out that when you're inferring H0, people use velocity dispersions of the galaxy to alleviate this term. But fundamentally, what I call the foreground convergence, the convergence between the observer and the lens, you can never get rid of. And that effect is on the order of 1%, which is quite small. But if you read the papers of people doing this work, they always say our goal is to get H0 within 1%. And so given this source of uncertainty, this is something we can't ignore. We can ask the same question for compound lensing. So here the parameter we're measuring is eta being a ratio of angular diameter distances. You might remember two distances or two distances. And the bias on this, once again, because the relationship is very simple, you always have these 1 minus kappa terms appearing. And what happens here is if you're imagining green, you have the constraints you can put on CPL parameterization. So WA, W naught, telling you about how dark energy is evolving through time. And in green, you would have what you would measure if you ignore these effects. And then these blue contours show you how that distribution would change depending on the lines of sight. This is what you expect to be able to measure. And what you can see is most of the time, this distribution just kind of wobbles around the center, but sometimes it can be offset. And it actually turns out that in 35% of cases, we have 2 sigma outliers, much more than the 5% you expect. And so again, these effects need to be taken account. But these are quite specific, and I don't think anyone's working on these problems in particular. But the general rule is when you're measuring distances or luminosities in space, you will always have this fundamental uncertainty in inhomogeneity. Something to keep in mind if you're trying to get very precise. So, any questions about that? So the main driving force for my group in Montpellier, what we're trying to do is see if we can actually use these effects as a new way to do it. So as I mentioned, we have convergence and shear, and I hope I've convinced you that convergence is hopeless. We can never measure it. It's just a fundamental source of uncertainty. Although there's maybe a disclaimer on that, depending on how much time I have, we'll see. But it turns out that the shear might be measurable. And you can, again, read some papers about this, but it seems that from a strong lensing system, the so-called line of sight shear term, which is, again, that combination of foreground, background, and overall terms, that might be measurable from those. It's measurable in simulations. In real data, it's still not completely certain that there's not some other degeneracies occur, but it's being done as you speak.
Just a quick question. I mean, on when does the shear?
So generally, convergence, the convergence and shear, if you have a light beam traveling from each you, convergence will be caused by kind of thin diffusion. Shear is caused by compact matter off the line of sight. So the light beam is traveling, and due to the presence of that, it gets.
Okay.
Yeah. So shear is convergence, diffused matter kind of spread out, the light travels through. Shear is like clumpy matter off the line of sight that causes the light to be diffused. These are in the tidal approximation. So it's basically the first order terms. Of course, you can have very nonlinear effects when you pass very close to mass, but generally speaking, you'll see them. So the point of these These weak lensing effects, they're the first order effects when you have this integrated collection of natural underlying stuff. So how does weak lensing and galaxy number counting and all of these observational cosmology tools that we have typically work? You have a collection of galaxies in the sky. You might say, well, let's take a look at their shape and let's correlate their shape. Let's have a look at if this is elliptical in this way, how likely is this one to be elliptical in the same way or in another way? And you start to build up correlation functions. You can do the same with galaxy over densities. So you can say, well, if I have a galaxy here, how likely is it to find another galaxy that has this separation and that separation? And you can also correlate those two things. So we can ask how likely is an elliptical galaxy that's elliptical in a certain way to be next to an overdense region of the sky. And this is the classic, this is what weak lenses do. This is what people who study baryonic acoustic oscillations do. This is what the field does. However, we expect to see about 100,000 lenses with Euclid, meaning we'll also have access to strong lens systems. And so what we propose is that if we can measure the shear on those systems, we can correlate this with these overdensities with the systems. Then we have a new way of doing cosmology. Well, that might seem crazy because we already have many, many, many more galaxies in the sky. But the difference is when you're looking at a galaxy's ellipticity, you have a noise which is many times larger than your signal. So the weak lensing effect is something like 5% of the ellipticity, and the rest of it comes from the intrinsic shape of the galaxy. So when you look at a galaxy, you can correlate massive numbers of these to start understanding the weak lensing that's going on. With strong lensing, however, a single system can give you an order 1% precision measurement in the optimistic case. But even if we had only an order 10% measurement, it still has the potential to massively increase the accuracy of our weak lensing. The other important thing is that we worry in weak lensing about so-called intrinsic alignments. So maybe because of the early structure of the universe, when galaxies form, they might end up being elliptical in the same way. And so the correlations in ellipticity that we see are actually nothing to do with weak lensing, but they're something more fundamental to the shape of the galaxies themselves. Strong lensing doesn't suffer from this effect because the shape of the galaxy is not determined with the shear that we measure. And so we can add these three new correlation functions, correlate the shear with the ellipticity, the shear with itself, and the shear with the galaxy number count. This is a new way to do cosmology. So
this is within the same cluster.
It's across the whole sky. So you basically, the survey, I can't remember the survey size of Euclid, but it's a pretty big chunk of the sky.
No, suppose the sun is here.
Yes.
So it's very less chance that this thing we relate with here and
yes. Exactly, yes. And the further apart things are, the weaker the matter power spectrum.
So I do expect that maximum viewing angle.
Well, again, very, very well anticipating the next part of the next part of the minute. No, it's great. You're asking all the right questions. So, I'm not going to. I suspect many people in this room will understand the spectrum a lot better than I do. I won't tend to teach you something you don't know. But the point is, what you're measuring is a correlation function. So you're measuring basically how correlated the effect is as a function of their separation. So what you can see is that the correlation becomes weaker and weaker for these terms as we move to higher angular separations. For these terms, okay, no, this is just a different expression. Sorry, for the blue and the orange are so-called plus and minus correlations. These are just two different ways of visualizing. The point is, those correlations might increase initially, but they scale. So the higher angular separations we can expect to be. And the reason for this, well, it's because this is fundamentally a probe of the matter power spectrum. And so what we're probing is how correlated matter is as a function of its separation. And what that in turn depends on, well, it's fundamental cosmology by any means. So by
the blue lines is a sharp drop of almost like a similarity.
Yes. I should have reminded myself. But I remember having a long chat with my supervisor about this and being convinced by the explanation. What I think it might be is a numerical effect of how this correlation works. But I'm actually so sorry, I can't tell you. I'll be able to tell you 5 minutes afterwards when I go back in my notes and remind myself. But off the top of my head, I can't remember. Yeah. So anyway, you measure these correlations. You get kind of a signal that depends on the angular separation. That signal depends on the angular power, the matter power spectrum, which in turn depends on your cosmology. And so by doing these correlations, you can really pin down what sigma 8 is, what omega m is, and that will help us see, well, these tensions we saw earlier, are these coming from something something fundamental, or is it just some problem of measurement? So my current work is disgusting looking things. So I've unfortunately there's 18 of them to calculate. We've done 6, so we're getting there. But basically, the key question is, what are the sources of uncertainty in measurement? So I should have included a diagram about this, which I didn't. But basically, there's 3 sources of uncertainty. There's the obvious one, which is the noise on the measurement. So if you measure the shear from a lens, how accurate is that measurement? But there's also 2 slightly more interesting ones. There's the so-called sparsity covariance, and this is something which I think might be a new addition to the field of weak lensing, at least by my supervisor and his team, because in weak lensing you have so many galaxies it doesn't matter. With strong lensing, because you have only a few galaxies in the sky, the sparsity covariance basically tells you that depending on which regions of the same sky you probe, you will come up with a different measurement. The way I always explain it, if you're measuring the average temperature of the ocean and you have 5 thermometers, depending on where you put those thermometers, the results change a whole. So sparsity covariance and noise drops with increasing measurement precision and with increasing measurements. Sparsity doesn't care about your measurement precision, but it does drop from the measurements we have. And then finally, we have the so-called cosmic covariance, which you cannot get rid of. It's a fundamental limitation of any measurement, and that's simply because the same set of cosmological parameters will present different distributions of matter in the universe depending on which roll of the dice it is. So because we only have one universe to probe, this is a fundamental limit of our precision we can put on these parameters. So the goal is to get these 2 sources of uncertainty below the level of the fundamentals. And it seems early days, but it seems that it is looking promising that we can actually get close to the cosmic covariance using these. It's exciting. Yes, we have 18 of these to calculate. And once we've calculated them, then we can go from these correlation functions to start to predict, well, how tightly we can constrain these parameters. And watch the space. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. So gravitational lensing, it's a powerful observation tool. You can do a lot of cool things with it. I mentioned this earlier in the day, but I didn't mention explicitly here. But what's so cool is you're probing angular diameter distances which don't start at the observer. You have access to distances starting at the lens and going to the source, and that's something that you can't really get in any other field of observation. That's quite exciting. Matter along the line of sight has a non-negligible effect, especially as we get more and more precise in our measurements. These uncertainties arising from sighting become increasingly important. If we ignore them, we can bias our measurements. We might think we've discovered something interesting, but that's just particularly dense line of sight or vice versa. But in fact, it's promising that these effects can allow us to actually find a new way to do cosmology and give us better sort of normal. So yeah, thank you so much. Please say if you have any questions, you can contact me, and if you're interested. But it works in all the.
So to come back to the question, because the magnetic waves in our frequencies, they do behave differently, a little bit differently when like in the larger wave. So that might give that might give you so you may be looking at radio sources. Yeah. So that is what
So yeah, it's an important question. Thank you. I think tell me if I've misunderstood, but I think the question's about basically wave optic effects. So we typically model gravitational lensing in a so-called geometrical optics, which basically you imagine your light beam as being infinitesimal. So the most important thing, you imagine the wavelength of the light is much shorter than the distance over which the gravity is acting, and so you basically don't need to care about the wavelength of the light. But with things like when you have light passing very close to a much smaller source, then you can imagine some wave optic effects, like for example diffraction. Diffraction is not something you will see in the geometric limit, but you have overlapping of waves and wave fronts summing up and these kind of things. So it's actually something my supervisor has worked on a lot. And it turns out that the geometric optic limit is good for any of the scientific things that we're interested in, even radio. But I think one area which that might change is gravitational waves. So gravitational waves can also be lensed, and in fact, it's a bit maybe not too technical, but I showed you images of, for example, 4 multiple image point sources. So you have light splitting up into 4 parts. 4 is generally the most you'll ever see. But actually, there's a 5th image, it's a 5th solution to your equations. But instead of being magnified, it's demagnified, and it passes straight through the center of the lens. So you can't see it because it's all the light from the lens, the galaxy itself. But because gravitational waves aren't blocked by light, you might be able to probe the real inner regions of galaxies using gravitational waves, and there you might have some wave optic effects. I think it's still, people tell me no, but it's not my experience. So that wavelength is, fortunately for our purposes, the only wavelength dependent effect is, well, not even wavelength dependent, but there's a redshift from the gravitational colors passing through, but otherwise, light only cares about mass, it doesn't care what type of mass, and that mass is affecting light regardless. So it keeps our job race.
The next question is, how does the CMB photons?
They are, yes. So CMB lensing is a whole field of study. It's not.
Does it affect the wavelength?
So I see. So you mean the other way around? So not. Do you mean the lensing of the CMB or CMB affecting the lens?
CMB affecting.
So because the CMB is so redshifted, we generally, the light we're looking at is not
so the photons don't affect this. Saying because reheating and all those kind of things have the inverse.
Yes. So not my field of expertise, but as I understand it, you'll have these effects in places like the intergalactic medium and when you have interactive matter. But because what's very lucky about gravitational lensing is generally the angular scales are quite large in the galaxy. So this light, as you've seen in the pictures, you often get a nice big ring with the main light of the galaxy well contained. And because the scales involved, we're not worried about individual sort of photons so much as the overall scale of the overall distribution of photons on our image. And so those kind of very, very small scale effects aren't a problem for us. It's not my expertise, but I have that.
We don't have any comments or questions from the online audience.
But thanks for listening. You came online.
If there's no further questions, then we'll thank Daniel once again. The online audience.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, cheers. It's my face. So it's just a bit more of the technical details, so things like the equations.
No, I mean
the actual yeah. So I what I did is I went into what's it called? This AI image generator, and I said, "Can you give me?" You choose an image. I said, "Can you give me a ring?" And then I just no, it's nothing. There's nothing real.
we actually can
Oh, thanks so much.